I have sent to the Congress today a series of proposals to help fight mental illness and mental retardation. These two afflictions have been long neglected. They occur more frequently, affect more people, require more prolonged treatment, cause more individual and family suffering than any other condition in American life. It has been tolerated too long. It has troubled our national conscience, but only as a problem unpleasant to mention, easy to postpone, and despairing of solution.
Welcome back. As you know, that was President John F. Kennedy back on February 5th, 1963. I think it's worth understanding this country's history in dealing with mental illness. In this bonus clip from the new CBS Miami documentary, Warehouse, The Life and Death of Tristin Murphy, Judge Steve Leifman walks us through our tortured past.
So the history of mental health in the United States is pretty tortured. When the country was first founded, we didn't know what to do with people with mental illnesses, so we put them in jail. And it pretty much remained that way until about 1840. And there was this wonderful woman by the name of Dorothea Dix. She was visiting a jail in Boston. And there were these 14 men she found segregated in the jail that had no heat. It was in the dead of winter, very little clothes, and they were literally freezing to death. So she went to see the jailer, and she's like, "Excuse me, who are these men, and why are you allowing them to freeze to death?" He's like, "Look, lady, they're just a bunch of lunatics." Ironically, he says to her, "They didn't commit any crimes, so I'm not getting paid to keep them here. What do you want me to do?" So this jailer, sheriff, is allowing people to freeze to death. So she adopted a movement that had begun in France called moral treatment. And the idea was to take people that were in custody that hadn't committed crimes and put them in asylums. And the idea is that you would put them in these small 120-bed asylums where they would be treated more humanely. And so she went to the Massachusetts legislature, she got them to pass the first asylum bills, and they started to move people from jail to the asylums. Well, the idea was to keep them small because there really wasn't a lot of treatment. It was just at least to be able to treat them better, and people got better. And we know why they got better, because their stress levels went down, and trauma is a big part of mental illness. And so we know the states, unfortunately, they want to be efficient, they want to be economical. So they started to consolidate the beds. They didn't want to pay for a bunch of 120-bed facilities. So these asylums grew into these massive state hospitals, 5, 10, 15, 20,000 patients. Very little oversight, if any. And they became these human experimentation facilities, these houses of horrors. The first quote-unquote treatment for people with mental illnesses at a state hospital was insulin shock therapy. They had done some rudimentary testing. They found that many of these folks had slightly elevated blood sugar levels, and the geniuses at the time decided, oh, they must have diabetes and that's what's causing their mental illness. We'll just give them insulin shock and cure them. Well, obviously that wasn't what the problem was. People got sick, they died, they checked that one off the list. But they said, you know, maybe we're onto something. We can shock people back into sanity. So they take them to a room, they'd put a stick in their mouth so they wouldn't bite off their tongue, they would put electrodes on their head, they'd plug it into an outlet, and they would shock the living daylights out of people, trying to shock them into sanity. Well, that didn't work either. Well, the last treatment that they tried was some guy who said he was a doctor by the name of Friedman, designed something called the Friedman pick. And they would take him to that same terrible room where they would do electric shock therapy, and they would tie him down to a bed, and they would take the pick and they would punch it behind their eye, and they would do a lobotomy. And this went on until like the 1970s. You know, a lot of us were still alive. This wasn't 100 years ago. And it also explains why so many people with these illnesses are so reticent to take treatment, because the history is just so horrible. What was his last public bill signing, like 1962, President Kennedy signed this $3 billion authorizing act that would have created this amazing national community mental health system. A lot of people didn't know this, but his sister Rose had mental health issues. She was lobotomized. It went terribly wrong, very tortured, and lived a really difficult life. So President Kennedy and his family were very sensitive to this issue. So new medications were coming out, they were oversold as a cure, and they thought that people did not need to be institutionalized their entire lives. So he signs this wonderful act. Tragically, he's assassinated, there's the escalation of the Vietnam War, and Congress never appropriates any of this $3 billion to set up this act. Well, at the same time, there's a whole slew of lawsuits around the country because of the mistreatment of this population. And the seminal case actually comes out of Alabama. And what the court basically finds, it's a federal judge, is that you have certain constitutional protections even in a state civil hospital. And he tells the states that, look, you have to upgrade these facilities. You can't treat this population the way you're treating them. If not, we're going to shut down your hospitals. And so the states basically had two choices at that point. They could spend the billions of dollars to upgrade their facilities, or they could shut them down and provide community-based treatment. Well, we know what most of them did. In 1955, there were about 560,000 state hospitals around the United States. Today, there's only about 32,000. If nothing had changed, and I'm not suggesting that because most people don't need to be in state hospitals for that period of time, if nothing changed, our population grew the way it ended up growing, we'd have about 1.5 million state hospital beds today. We have 32,000. Well, at the same time, most of our hospital beds got shut down. We had the war on drugs, we had the war on crime, we had massive cuts to housing, and it created this perfect storm. And so we estimate that there were maybe 5,000 people in 1955 in jails and prisons with serious mental illnesses and 550,000 people in state hospitals. Well, today it's the exact opposite. And so what Dorothea Dix had started to move people out of jails, ironically, has reversed itself.
And so this is where we find ourselves. But as we are trying to stress, there is help out there. And that brings us back to the 988 system. I spoke to Gail Geis, the president of the Florida Mental Health Advocacy Coalition, about the importance of 988.
I do want to give you some hope. I mean, I think 988 holds a lot of hope. I mean, I think we got to back up and get completely out of the criminal justice system. I mean, mental illness is not a crime. It is a brain disorder, and we need to start looking at it as a neurobiological brain disorder. It needs to be underneath whole health, and it needs to be treated that way. It's horrible that we treat an illness in such a punitive way and criminalize it. So 988 holds a lot of promise. You can call, and I saw it at the end of the documentary. I was thrilled that you mentioned 988. You can call and talk to a crisis counselor that can get you referred to local resources, or maybe send a mobile response team. And we are advocating heavily to get those Lifeline centers funded in a recurring and sustainable way, so that they're ready for the increases in calls and texts and chats that we're expecting. 988 is another option for families like mine. You know, someone in my family had a psychotic break about 15 years ago, and I had no clue what to do, and we lost a couple of years, which impacts prognosis in a negative way. So if we could have called 988 just to get the right treatment started, that early intervention is so important. But we're trying to build in Florida that 988 system with the call centers, the mobile response teams, the centralized receiving centers, where you can go for up to 23 hours and be stabilized and linked to services. And of course, the CSUs as well. So it's all a system that's got to be connected. There's a lot of work to be done, but I think that provides us with a lot of hope.
When you talk about increasing funding for Lifeline or maintaining funding for Lifeline, tell me a little bit more about what you mean by that.
Well, Florida has 13 National Suicide Prevention Lifeline call centers. It used to just be called the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Now it's called the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. And so when the federal law was passed in 2020, they added behavioral health crises. And that is really critical. So it's not only about suicide, it's about any behavioral health crisis or emotional disorder. Somebody has a panic attack, and if another family member doesn't know what's going on, so they can call 988 and get help. As far as funding goes, the state of Florida has been using federal funding. They've been passing through the federal funding from SAMHSA that we've been getting, but it's not sustainable funding. We've
Is funding an issue though?
right now we're expecting about 8 million to Florida for 3 years. Each of 3 years, it has to go through the Department of Children and Families. They have to take a percentage of that for administrative use. You know, we've got 13 call centers. That's less than $1 million, obviously, per call center. I think they're going to need a whole lot more than that. We are expecting nationally the contacts going to 988 to go from 5 million in year one, we're in year two already, to 9 million. So that's a huge increase.
As I said at the outset, there is more that the state and the courts can do to tackle this problem. And in the weeks ahead, we will press to hold various officials accountable. This is not the end of the story, it's just the beginning. And again, if you would like to see our documentary, Warehouse, The Life and Death of Tristin Murphy, you can find it on cbsmiami.com. I hope you'll check it out.